Welcome to Undisclosed Episode 3, Jay's Day. So who was Jay? Jay was a former Woodlawn High School student. He graduated a year before Adnan and Hay. He knew them primarily because of Stephanie, his girlfriend. Stephanie and Jay had dated since middle school. Stephanie had been friends with Adnan since middle school, too. They were pretty close. Stephanie and Jay, remember, were in the magnet program together, and they had been crowned king and queen of the junior prom in the spring of '98. But the thing we all want to know is, were Adnan and Jay friends? By all reports that we have that are documented, they were really more of acquaintances than friends. And that's from Jay's own testimony at trial and from Jen's interview with the police. Okay, so moving into Jay's day. The problem with trying to plot out Jay's day is that he has given at least 7 different stories about what happened on January 13th. There were 4 stories from police interviews, there were 2 stories from trial testimonies, and there was an interview with The Intercept after Serial came out. The fact of the matter is that there's really not that much that's consistent about all of these stories. There's nothing consistent in the details, but you'd expect that the details might fluctuate, but also really not in the big picture. There are only a few things, and they're really minor things that are consistent. And even the consistencies have inconsistencies attached to them. So, let's take a look. So he consistently says that Hay's body was buried in Lincoln Park. But the time of the burial varies dramatically. He consistently says that at least one of the instruments used to bury Hay's body was a shovel, and that the shovel came from the house of someone related to him. But which house it came from varies across interviews. He consistently says that he has Adnan's car and phone on January 13th. He consistently says that he was at Jen's house on January 13th until at least 3:40. But that's inconsistent with the state's theory of the case at trial, which said that Hay was killed by 2:36, which is when the Best Buy Come and Get Me call took place. Finally, he's consistent that at some point on January 13th, Adnan showed him Hay's body in the trunk of her car, which was a Nissan Sentra, by the way. We've had some conversation about how big her car was. So it was, kind of a mid-size, like a compact to mid-size kind of car. You can look up Nissan Sentra to find out. But both the time and the location of that trunk pop vary a lot. So there's really no spine to his story. There's no, one thread running through that's consistent. And even if there were that spine running through it, Jay has admitted himself that he has lied in various statements. So that leaves us with 2 things we can use to try to figure out the real story of Jay's day. We can look at what other witnesses have to say about interacting with Jay on that day, and we can look at sort of the evolution of his story. What parts of the story changed, how it morphed from the first police interview to the story that he eventually told at trial. Now, as far as witnesses are concerned, we only have statements from 2 witnesses who say they saw Jay on that day. We have Kathy, that's not her real name, Kathy, whose name is being protected, and we have Jen. So there are a few important landmarks on that day we can try to figure out. First, when did Jay go over to Jen's house in the morning? Then what did Jen and Jay do while he was at her house? Then when did Jay leave her house? When did Jen and Jay meet up again later that evening? And then what did they actually do that evening? Okay, so first, when did Jay get to Jen's house? Well, according to Jen, she called Jay sometime between 10 a.m. and noon that day to invite him to come over to hang out. She went home after work. Jay showed up about an hour later. In her interview with the cops, she says that was at about 1:30. According to Jay, he went over to Jen's house to hang out with Mark, Jen's little brother. They played video games, he went to the mall, and then Jen came over later. Okay. So what did Jay and Jen do while Jay was at her house? Well, according to Jen, she and Jay were at her house all afternoon, and Jay never left. According to Jay, he left multiple times. According to Jay, he remembers both Adnan and Jen calling him while he was at Jen's. According to Jen, she doesn't remember any phone calls. When Jen talks about them to the police, they're actually telling her about the phone calls. And there is this question of why Jen would be calling Jay at Jen's house if Jen is there with Jay at the house. The whole thing is really confusing. So Jen's memory of what they were doing that day is actually really hazy. And the thing is, that's really weird, because according to Jay, he dropped this bomb on her. He said Adnan was going to kill Hay. So he was saying he knew Adnan had this plan to kill Hay. But according to Jay, when he told Jen that, she didn't react. She didn't really believe him. But doesn't that seem weird? Like, doesn't it seem like you'd remember that day if that was the day someone said that another person had a plan to kill somebody and then that person disappeared the next day? Like, wouldn't that make your memories really clear? But Jen says she really doesn't remember that much of that day. Okay? But then Jay also says that he had told Jen that information the day before. So maybe that's why she wasn't surprised, because it's day-old information, or she doesn't believe him, or I don't know. But either way, either Jay is lying about telling Jen about the murder plot, or she's lying about knowing about the murder plot ahead of time. Either way, Jay and Jen are telling completely different stories about what happened when they hung out that day. So the third question, when did Jay leave Jen's house? Well, here's the tricky thing about this. Jen and Jay firmly agree on this one point. Jay left the house at 3:30 or 3:40. What's the problem with this? Well, the problem with this is that the state's theory of the case says that Hay was dead before the 2:36 come and get me call. So to recap, one version of Jay's story is that Adnan told him to expect a call on Jen's landline at 3:30. But Adnan didn't call, so Jay left. He went to his friend Jeff's house, but before he got to the door, Adnan called and said, "Come and get me, the bitch is dead." This is the only thing Jay manages to say consistently in nearly every interview. The call was at 3:40, and Jen agrees. Jay left her house around 3:40. So if we believe this, if we believe that Jay left Jen's house at around 3:40, there are some key parts of the state's case that are really undermined here. We've got the Nisha call. The state says that the Nisha call happened at 3:32. So the state says Adnan had to have killed Hay and been back with his phone by 3:32 because that's when the Nisha call was made. That's the call that ties Adnan to his phone and therefore the car and makes us know that he was not at school where he says he was. But if Jay was at Jen's waiting for Adnan's call at 3:30 or 3:40, how did the Nisha call happen at 3:32? Here's the other thing. Jay says Adnan called him on the cell phone. But if you look at Adnan's call log, there is no incoming call anywhere around 3:40 p.m. There's a call at 3:15. There's another call at 4:30. That's it. So there's pretty much one thing that Jen and Jay agree on and that we might be able to put some stock in, and that's what time he left her house. But that's totally inconsistent with the case that the state put on at trial. So Jay and Jen agree on one thing that doesn't really help the state's case, but they stick to it. They won't budge. Why is that the one thing they won't budge on? Well, it's their alibi. If they're accounted for during the time of Hay's death and accounted for by each other, then they can't be implicated in the death. So that's the one thing they can't budge on. They can't change their stories on that because they're protecting themselves and each other. Okay, so according to Jay, Adnan calls him. They meet up at Best Buy and, shocker, there are a couple different versions of what happens next. So Jay says he drops Adnan back off for track, and then Adnan calls him again after practice to come pick him up. But Adnan says that never happened, and he never left the campus after school. And remember from episode 1 that there are witness statements that corroborate that, namely the coach. The call patterns on the cell also corroborate what Adnan is saying. Track practice ended around 5, and there's one call to the phone that goes to voicemail at 5:14. But at 5:38, there's a call made to Krista, who's a friend of Adnan's, which means Adnan was probably with the phone and Jay. In fact, Jay initially told the cops that they went to get food and they smoked pot, and then the whole Kathy episode happened. Call records also support the idea that Jay and Adnan left each other around 8 p.m. Between whatever time they got together in the afternoon or evening until 8 p.m., we know that Adnan received a call from Hay's brother and then spoke to the officer who was with Hay's brother. So, question 4. When and how did Jen and Jay meet up again? Well, Jay tells the cops that after he and Adnan bury the body, abandon the car, and toss the shovels or the picks or whatever that version of the story says, after they dump the stuff in the dumpster at the mall, Adnan drops Jay off at home. Jay says he pages Jen and she calls him back at his house. He says she came right over, he changed clothes, put them in a plastic bag, and went out to the car and told Jen what happened. But, according to Jen, and according to the prosecution's case at trial, Adnan dropped Jay off at the mall. Jen saw Adnan and he said, "Hey, what's up, girl?" Her going to the mall to pick him up doesn't quite make sense, though. He would have been all dirty from the burial. But Jen is really clear. She picked him up from the mall, and there was no sign that he'd been burying a body in the woods. She says he looked the same as when he got to her house at 1 or 1:30 that day. Now, Jay says that after they met up, Jen helped him throw away the clothes he was wearing while burying the body. But Jay says it happened that night. Jen says it happened the following afternoon when she picked Jay up after work. All right, so our last question. What did Jay and Jen do that evening? Well, you will not be surprised to hear that they disagree on this point too. One thing that they do agree on is that they went to see Stephanie. But Stephanie's account contradicts that. And we have the records of her basketball game that day to show us that she's right and they're wrong. She didn't get home from her game till after 10 p.m. And she says he showed up at her house at about 11:30 p.m. And here's something wonky, as if there weren't enough wonky things in this. The whole reason Jay borrowed Adnan's car was so he could go to the mall to get Stephanie a birthday present. But according to Stephanie, he didn't even give her the present until the next day. Okay, so according to Jay and Jen, they went to see Stephanie at 8:30. But according to Stephanie in the game records, the earliest they could have been at her house is 10. So what were they doing between 8:30 and 10? Well, we don't know. Okay, so now comes the fun. You know how they've been referring to Kathy? But that's not her real name, so they've been calling her not her real name, Kathy. Well, after Serial came out and the court records got opened up and the media jumped in and new hearings started happening, her name became public. That means that protecting her with an alias is pretty pointless now. So her name is Christy, and they're going to call her Christy from now on. We'll try to remember that Christy is not her real name, Kathy, so that we can keep it all connected. So Jay says they stopped by Stephanie's house, which we know didn't happen, and then they went to Christy's house. But Jen says that first they went to a party with her sorority sisters and her friend Mike. She comments that she basically always overschedules herself because she has a lot of friends and she likes to keep them all happy. It was Mike's birthday. He was giving her a hard time about leaving, but she knew that they still needed to get to Christie's. Now, Susan jumps in here to point out that this is really weird. Jen allegedly just learned that one person she knew just murdered another person she knew. And another person she knows helped bury the body. But the first thing she's concerned about is making sure she doesn't miss Mike's party. Those are some really odd priorities. I'm with Susan on that. But Jay doubles down on the sorority party. He is consistent that they never went to a sorority party that day. They went directly to Christie's. And he says in trial that Jen is mistaken or lying about this. Now, Christy isn't much help in this. We know from an earlier episode that because of her conference reference, she was probably thinking about the wrong day. So it's totally possible that Jen is also thinking about the wrong day, a day when Stephanie might have actually been home around 8:30. So we do have a handful of places where Jen and Jay's stories match up. It seems like that means, at least to an extent, that Jen's story corroborates Jay's. To whatever extent we can look at it, there is some corroboration there. Except for one thing. During one of the pre-interviews, and we know this because Jay testified to it, during one of the pre-interviews, the police told Jay how his story was different from Jen's, and they told him what the inconsistencies were. That means they basically gave him a chance to change his story, his recorded story, so that his recorded story would match Jen's. That means that just because Jay and Jen both say an event happened, it doesn't necessarily mean that event happened. So even those small inconsistencies aren't even really necessarily consistencies. Crud. So there's one more witness. There's Mark, Jen's brother. Remember, Adnan said he went over to the house to hang out with Mark. He says they played video games together, he went to the mall, he came back, and Jen came home later, and then they hung out. So what does Mark say about what happened that day? Well, we don't know. According to the state's records, there was never an interview between the police and Mark. This is crazy. He's basically part of Jay's alibi. Why wouldn't the police follow up on that to confirm that basic detail? Now, on Jay's lying, we've always known Jay lies. He admits to it. But we don't know why, because there are some things that he lies about that are just absolutely like, why would you lie about them? How is this working? Well, here's where you're going to have to listen to the Real podcast, because they have some primary source material, some actual interviews that you need to hear. So I'm going to let them finish up.
If you've read my blog, you know that I've spent a lot of time analyzing Jay's interview statements. There's a lot of weird stuff in there, but when you read a transcript, the context for a lot of statements is lost. When parts of the dialogue don't seem to make sense or don't add up, you're left wondering if there's some sort of tone of voice or some inflection or something else about the interaction that could explain why they're saying the things they've said. So when I finally got the audio for the interviews a couple weeks ago, I was pretty excited. The first thing that stood out to me was the pauses. They're long, they're frequent, they don't show up in the transcript. So I had no idea exactly how long Jay was waiting in between answers. He didn't know what to say a lot of the time. You just hear 10, 15, 20 seconds of him apparently thinking of how to answer a question. And they don't show up in the transcripts because they just show what he said without the gaps. So then I noticed something else. The same thing kept happening over and over again. To show you what I'm talking about, let's play a clip from one of the interviews. Here, Jay is describing what happens after he and Adnan go to Patapsco State Park to smoke weed. Or, as Jay put it, to go rockinelle in the park.
Okay. What happens then?
We leave there, I believe, can you bear with me for a minute? Okay, we left there. I took him back to schooling, and I dropped him off.
Did you catch that? Jay is responding to someone after that pause. And not just that, there's a tap tap, and then Jay says, "Oh, okay." And suddenly, a moment later, he knows the answer. I first heard the tapping after I listened through the clips a few times, and then shortly after that, I found a document in the police file that seemed to correlate with those tappings. And I spent a lot of time checking and double checking to make sure I wasn't hearing something that wasn't there, or that this wasn't a tapping that appeared all over the interviews in all kinds of places. But again and again, the pattern held. Jay gets confused, pauses too long, or starts to say the wrong thing, and tap, tap, tap. And Jay knows the answer suddenly. So finally I got the clips together and I sent them to Amar, our sound guy. I asked him to make sure those sounds were really there, so he cleaned up the audio for me. And yeah, those sounds are there. Let's play that same clip again, but this time with the audio cleaned up.
Okay. What happens then?
We leave there, I believe, can you bear with me for a minute? Okay, we left there. I took him back to schooling.
Jay forgot what happened after Patapsco. He didn't remember the next sequence of events involved him taking Adnan to track so that Adnan can set up an alibi. But a tapping reminds him.
Can you bear with me for a minute? Okay, we left there.
To show what the tapping's actually doing, let's look at another clip. This one's from the first interview, and it's describing what happens after Adnan and Jay leave Edmondson Avenue and head up towards the park and ride.
Car followed me, and so I get in the car and I follow him, and we end up at the 70 parking ride off of what is that? Cook Lane.
What is that? It sounds like Jay's referring to something, like a map. In fact, there are a series of maps in the police file, with the cell towers labeled and the times of key calls scribbled in. These maps don't display most road names, but they do list some of the roads, and Cook's Lane is one of the roads labeled, leading directly to the park and ride. In fact, almost without exception, the only roads that Jay is capable of naming are the roads that are displayed on these maps. Here's what Jay says when asked to describe what happened when Patrick didn't answer his phone. That's the 3:59 p.m. call that Jay says was a call to try and find weed. Now, in this clip, listen for the paper shuffling that occurs just as Jay switches to the part of the story involving the trip to Forest Park to try and score weed.
What do you do then after the phone message?
We head to Forest Park to see if we can find a corner salesman there. We go down there, we buy 2 Don sacks. We turn around, I believe we stopped to get blunts on Rogers and Gwinoak and Rogers, in the corner of Gwinoak and Rogers.
Again, we have a long pause, and suddenly Jay comes up with the answer. He names a corner. Rogers and Gwinoaks. For a guy who says he doesn't really know street names, that's oddly specific. And it also never came up in his first interview, so How is he suddenly remembering now the name of a corner that he didn't know back then? Well, it turns out that among those roads listed on the maps, in the Forest Park area, there are only a couple corners that are named. And yeah, Gwyn Oak and Rogers are among the two most prominently displayed. In the next part of the interview, this is also from the first interview, Jay describes how he went to meet Adnan off of Edmondson Avenue after getting the come and get me call. Jay immediately starts talking about how he then followed Adnan to some other location. He's jumping to the part of the story where they go to the park and ride. But the cops stop him. They prompt him to get back on track and to tell about the next important event in his story.
You arrived 20 minutes later, this location on Edmondson Avenue. Then what happened?
I followed him out into...
Do you get out of your car when you get on Edmondson Avenue and have any conversations with him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tell me about that.
We got out, and he's walking around with gray gloves on.
Red gloves, are they
Winter gloves. With,
cloth gloves or?
Yeah, they're like wool with leather palms, and that spark. I was, I'd be walking around with gloves on for it, and then I'm sorry, and then he goes, "I did it. You don't fucking believe me? I did it." And pops the trunk open, and he's like, he's all bent up and balloon in the trunk.
Okay, in case you didn't catch that, listen to that last part one more time. Jay started making up some conversation that he had with Adnan about his gloves, a conversation Jay never ever mentions again, and has no point. The cops don't like it, they stop him. And then Jay changes the direction of his story.
And he's walking around with gray gloves on.
Red gloves, are they
Winter gloves with
cloth gloves or?
Yeah, they're like wool with leather palms, and that spark. I was, I'd be walking around with gloves on for it, and then I'm sorry, and then he goes, "I did it. You don't fucking believe me? I did it." And pops the trunk open, and he's like, he's all bent up and balloon in the trunk.
First, Jay apologizes. Why is he apologizing? Because someone in that room is giving him a look or a stare, telling him he screwed up. He got it wrong. Then you hear a tap-tap sound, and Jay says the word pups, as if he's reading it. And then confidently, he launches into the story that he'd forgotten before, the part about how Adnan pops the trunk open and shows him Hayes' body. Another thing I've discussed on my blog is how convoluted Jay's whole story about the burial really is. It's way over elaborate and involves 3 or 4 trips back and forth from a parking spot to the burial site, and involves an extremely inefficient series of events. And Jay can't keep track of it. He repeatedly gets confused, trying to describe where all these pieces are moving about, trying to describe where the shovels are, where the car is, where Adnan's car is, and where Hayes' car is. And he often forgets one of the cars, and he'll end up describing how Adnan was walking around the streets, forgetting that Adnan should have had Hayes' car to drive around in. So when Jay tries to describe in the interview where Hayes' car was located, guess what we hear again? That's right, tap, tap, tap.
And both cars were parked back in the parking spot.
No, just his car. Her car had been moved to the spot around the corner prior to us digging the hole.
Let's play that cleaned up again so you can hear it better. We have McGillivray asking Jay where the cars are and trying to subtly remind Jay, are they parked back in the parking spot? Jay says, well, no, her car is ... And suddenly he knows it's around the corner. And this spot is shown on the maps. You can see the burial site and you can see the road where it does kind of a dog leg back to where the cars were supposed to be. Someone's tapping on that corner.
And both cars were parked back in the parking spot.
No, just his car. Her car had been moved to the spot around the corner prior to us digging the hole.
The detectives are not shy about reminding Jay how many cars he's supposed to have at any point in the story and where those cars are supposed to be. But as the interview goes on, they start getting less and less subtle about it. In fact, Detective McGillivray starts sounding downright exasperated. And I don't really blame him because Jay screws up quite a bit. So Jay makes his umpteenth mistake of the day, and you can hear the frustration from the detectives.
What do you do then?
We drive to Westview. I told him to take me home. And on the way going home, we passed by Westview, and he said, I better get rid of this stuff.
You've got 2 cars.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm missing
Okay.
time spots. Yes, I'm sorry. We leave. We still do have 2 cars. He motions for me to follow him. I follow him. We're driving around all in the city. I ask him, where the hell are we going? And he says, where's a good strip at? I need a strip.
Okay, so McGillivray reminds Jay that they've got 2 cars, and Jay apologizes and adopts it into a story. It's worth noting, though, that Jay immediately forgets again that there are 2 cars in the story. Did you hear where Jay started describing a conversation that he and Adnan had while they're driving around in 2 separate cars? Apparently, Adnan was able to telepathically communicate with Jay during this whole series of events. But the 2-car issue aside, Jay makes a really interesting comment during this exchange. In response to McGillivray's exasperated sigh, he says, I'm missing and top spots.
You've got 2 cars.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm missing time spots. Yes, I'm sorry. We leave. We still do have 2 cars.
So what on earth is he referring to? I'm missing top spots? It turns out that the police file doesn't just have maps. It also has a document called Jay's Chronology. It has a numbered list of 24 events about what occurred on January 13th. And event number 22 starts at the very bottom of the first page and continues on to the second page. It says, Jay in Honda follows Adnan in Nissan to 300 Edgewood, where Nissan is dumped. So what is Jay missing? And what are the top spots? Could it be that Jay meant he was missing page 2 of the chronology, and then when he found where page 2 was, he was reading off the top spots of it? Sounds like it. Now, there are also other indications in the interviews that Jay is following off the chronology. For example, let's take what happens after Adnan receives the phone call from Officer Adcock. According to the Jay's Chronology document, the next 2 events are numbers 16 and 17. Number 16 says, Adnan asked Jay to help get rid of the body. They drive to Jay's house, get shovels, then to park and ride. Number 17 says, Jay in Honda follows Adnan in Nissan to Rolling Road, to Dogwood, to Holyfield, to Johnny Cake, and back to Woodlawn. And eventually to Dogwood, to Kernan, to other streets, then the burial site. Let's hear how Jay tries to describe these 2 events in his story.
We go back to the 70 parking lot. He gets out of his car, tells me to follow him. He gets into her car. He drives it. We drove around to a whole bunch of different places. Some off of Rolling Road, some off of Dogwood Road. Finally, he goes down past Lincoln Park. No, this is wrong. I'm sorry. I missed something. We leave Christy and Jeff's, and I ask him to drop me off. And we go back to my house, and when we're standing on my porch, that's when he tells me that we have to go back, we have to get rid of the body, we have to get rid of the body.
Jay apologizes and says that he missed something. Yeah, he did. He missed number 16. And eventually he realized it and went back to add it to the story. And that brings us to Christy, aka not her real name, Kathy, and how it is she came to be part of the story. So Kathy says that Adnan and Jay visited her place on the 13th, and as we talked about earlier, her memories actually link to a different day. So why does Kathy's apartment magically appear in Jay's later interviews? Well, it goes back to those maps, the one in the police file. In one map, the detectives have the location of a certain cell tower correctly marked. It's a tower that's next to Westview Mall, not too far from Jay's house. And in this map, the one the detectives were using, it also displays fast food restaurants. So right next to where the detectives have the cell tower marked, there's a McDonald's shown. It's on Rolling Road. Here's what Jay says in his first interview about the phone call Adnan received from Officer Adcock.
Okay. When he gets the call from the officer, where are you guys? Are you up at the parking lot?
No, we're at a restaurant. We sit down and eat.
Where exactly? What's the name of the restaurant?
I think we're at McDonald's on Rolling Road.
On McDonald's Rolling Road?
Yeah.
At a McDonald's on Rolling Road. We know Jay was lying about this. He's admitted to it. So, where did he get such an oddly specific lie from? I can think of one way that he might have been able to figure that out. There's this map of a cell tower that shows it right next to a McDonald's on Rolling Road. In the second interview, though, Jay suddenly says that he was at Kathy's when the cops called. In fact, that's the second trip that Jay had made to Kathy's that day. He says he was also at Kathy's an hour earlier, while Adnan was at track.
Where do you go?
I was on my way home, but then I stopped off at Gilston Park and I smoked another blunt before I went home. And then I think I may have gone, yeah, I went to Christian Jeff's. And he called me from the cell phone there. And then I left Christian Jeff's.
Hang on.
So, once again, we have a long, awkward Jay pause. There's a tap. And Jay magically comes up with the right answer. Or, in this case, the wrong answer, because there is absolutely no chance Jay was hanging out with Kathy from 4:30 to 5 p.m. that day. So why would the cops prompt Jay to give an incorrect answer? Well, remember that tower next to the McDonald's on Rolling Road? There's a second map showing the area around Kathy's apartment. In that map, though, they've taken the tower that was next to the McDonald's, and they've marked it about 3 miles south. There isn't a tower there. The cops got it wrong. There's some confusion over street names. But the cops thought the tower was there, and the spot they mistakenly placed the tower at is about a quarter of a mile from Kathy's apartment. That's the tower that calls are made on from 4:30 to 5 p.m. that day. So the detectives have this map where the cell tower that pings at 4:30 and 5 p.m. has been incorrectly placed next to Kathy's. And the cops think, well, the phone must be next to Kathy's apartment because that's what our maps are saying. So they need Jay to comply with their map and to say that, he was at Kathy's when those calls were made. And even though he wasn't there and couldn't have been there, he complies and tells them that he was there from 4:30 to 5.
This is a pretty serious allegation here against the Baltimore Police Department. I mean, it's basically saying that they really coached Jay into giving the version of events they wanted. And if that sounds like something that could never happen, there was a similar case just a couple of years ago. There was a man by the name of Ezra Mabel, and he was convicted of murder. Specifically, the claim was that he killed a drug lord. And he was eventually released from prison and brought a civil case against the Baltimore Police Department, the mayor, the city, and his claim was that some of the testimony against him was coached, and some of the detectives in that case were the same detectives in this case. According to him, one of the two key eyewitnesses in the case was a woman who, according to the complaint, didn't even see anything having to do with the murder. In fact, it appeared she was high and or drunk during the interview, and the claim in his complaint is that she was threatened with being arrested unless she told the police that she had seen the defendant, Ezra Mabel, with a gun exiting the victim's car. And so, yes, pretty serious allegations here, but it's not the first time someone's claimed in a murder case in Baltimore would have claimed that witnesses against him were coached.
And let me just note here that on the stand at trial, Jay testified under cross-examination by Gutierrez that, in fact, the police had said to him that they would charge him with the murder if he, was not acting as a witness. So what we have here then in layman's terms is what Colin mentioned, police coaching. Let me say that again. The police coached Jay through his statements. I don't even know if coaching is the right word. Maybe the right word is fed him his statements. They corrected him when he messed up. He apologized repeatedly. They gave him a map. They gave him a chronology to reference. And how did they manage to do that without saying a word so that it never showed up in the transcript? They did it by tapping. What's really frightening is, though, that not only were they able to coach and feed Jay into admitting details that were completely mundane, they took it to the extent that Jay admitted to some really serious stuff because of the coaching.
The detectives are repeatedly bullying Jay into giving answers that they want. The detectives will tell Jay that he needs to give a certain answer, and again, Jay complies. He does say what they tell him to say. And it's not that subtle either. For example, here's when the detectives are asking Jay about whether, on January 13th, he told Christy and Jeff about his murder.
If I had told him, my exact words would have been that dude killed his girlfriend.
No. Not if you told
Okay,
him.
I'm sorry.
What did you tell Jeff?
That dude killed his girlfriend.
And what did Jeff say to you?
For real? Oh, snap.
That's it.
This never happened. Jay didn't tell Jeff. Jay testified that this whole scene never occurred. But when the detective asked him to say, "What did you tell Jeff?" Jay agrees, makes up a story. He even makes up an answer for Jeff. For real? Oh, snap. And Jay doesn't just make up stories about who he told about the murder. He makes up stories about much more serious things. In fact, the police got Jay to falsely confess to accessory before the fact to murder, a crime that is itself punishable as murder.
He calls you that night to tell you, "I'm going to kill her and I need your assistance."
No. He calls me, wants to know if he can hook up, and then he's going to kill her.
Okay. But you take that as he's going to need your assistance.
Okay, yes.
Okay.
That right there is conspiracy and accessory. Jay agreed to help Adnan with Hayes' murder. And again, we know this didn't happen because that phone call he's talking about on January 12th was 18 seconds. There is no way that Jay and Adnan discussed relationships, discussed the plan to kill Hay, and discussed where to get weed the next day, all in the space of not even half a minute. So why is Jay confessing to a crime that could put him in jail for life? If Jay is willing to make up a story that implicates himself in murder, why wouldn't he also be making up a story to implicate Adnan in murder?
Now, if you really paid attention to Serial, you'll remember that Jen was interviewed by the police first, twice in fact, before the police went and picked up Jay. According to Jen, she told Jay that the cops wanted to talk to her, and he told her, "You know what, go ahead and talk to them, and send them to me." Which make you think, well, if Jen spoke to the cops first, and her story was, similar to Jay's, then maybe he wasn't actually coached. Jen had the same thing to say, kind of. But what if Jay had been speaking to the cops long before they got to Jen, and long before Jay supposedly led them to the car? Did he lead them to the car? Next time on the Undisclosed Addendum.